Hey, welcome back to the Spector Creative channel where we talk all things toy. And I'm Scott, Toy Guru Neitlich, your host. Today we're going to talk about some firsts and how we know it's a first. I mean, some things are, called the first in the title of the property. For other things, we have to get one of those sort of, big book reference books off the shelf and look things up. And, not that book. I mean, like a real book. Those fun fact books, right? We all had them as kids back when we had encyclopedias. I guess now you can just Google things. But what fun is that? I miss books. I know Egon said print is dead. But again, a lot of firsts are well known. Everybody knows that George Washington was the world's very first breakdancer. It's a historic fact, and it's why he's on the $1 bill. We also know who was the first man on the moon. It was Jules Verne. Some things we don't know, though, like who was the first kangaroo to successfully beat a human being in a boxing match. These facts are lost to time. And when it comes to toys, there are some toys that it's well known who came first, if you will, the R2 or the Chewie. Well, rather, where did we get our first Star Wars toys? We know this. We know this because there's a sort of a big part of the Star Wars brand and the Star Wars toy launch was the holiday early bird certificate kit that brought us our very first Star Wars toys. So that's part of toy culture. Other things like He-Man. We all know where the first He-Man came from. It was Mattel in 1982. It was linked obviously later on to the Filmation series, but the toy line did come first. And yeah, if you wanted to get a He-Man in the 80s, this was the very first He-Man. It's well known. It came on the bright red packaging. He had the blonde hair of the president of Mattel at the time. Ninja Turtles, another good example. 1987, they hit the world by storm. Obviously, the actual brand predated that. It was black and white, it was a little bit more adult. But when it became kid and pizza friendly, we know our first toys came from Playmates in 1987, and we all enjoyed squishing the heads of Rocksteady and Bebop. Now, other characters, and characters who are very well known, Superman, for example, if you ask the average toy collector at a convention on the street or on social media, where was the first Superman toy? Or even a character like Wolverine, who's had a ton of figures, probably almost more than anyone but Batman. Well, sure, we've had first appearance Wolverines, but where was the first figure? Or some obscure villains from different characters. When did they first get a toy? Well, to understand this, we obviously have to do a little history of toys, and this is actually one of the more interesting histories, and let's kind of explore that together. Hey, why not? Let's start off with the big man in blue himself, Superman, last son of Krypton. A lot of toys over the years, a lot of toys. The very first came out of Ideal. So Ideal was a toy company that made a lot of toys in the, going all the way back to the early 1900s. They were well known for making plush. They were well known for making robots. I mean, everybody made robots back then, especially in the 1950s, because that was like the thing before we had droids, I guess. One of the more well-known was the Mr. Machine robot from the 1960s. And while the company did a lot of its production right here in America and was well known as a American-founded company, the company itself is long gone, but its legacy definitely remains. It's one of those things that has embedded itself in toy culture. And they were also one of the first to do licensed toys. One of the more well-known was the Shirley Temple doll. So back when getting licenses to make toys based on IP or actors or comic books, movies, they really broke a lot of boundaries. They also developed some of the very first what could be considered action figures as opposed to dolls, although there's a lot of argument over what is what. And a huge line they did in the 30s and 40s included wooden articulated figures. While Jiminy Cricket was really cool, what probably made a lot more sense was Pinocchio. So, hey, a wooden Pinocchio figure that was articulated? Exactly. And as they got into licensed action figures or licensed characters made of wood, along comes in 1940 the very first Superman toy. This was made of wood and was actually pretty highly articulated, especially for the time. He stood 13 inches tall, he had a cloth cape, and he came in a coffin-like brown box, calling him a Superman doll. The whole doll versus action figure debate can continue. But yeah, the Man of Steel there himself, 1940. You had to go, Well, almost a decade before you got a Superman action figure if you were a kid back then. Can you imagine? There were 10 years where there were no Superman toys, ever. But hey, if you want to talk about a bigger gap, let's look at the other DC mainstay, and that, of course, is going to be good old Bats. There are probably more Batman action figures than any other superhero. Because one, he's incredibly toyetic, he's incredibly collectible, and once it was figured out that you can make lots of variants in the late 80s, early 90s, well, Batman, like Superman, created in the late 30s, but no action figures for a long time. This panel, well, this cover from the 30s is really what spawned so many action figure variants and was the impetus behind doing them. But it wasn't until the 1960s, right before the Adam West show premiered, that we got our very first Batman action figure. So we're not talking a decade, we're talking like 3 decades to get a Batman toy. And the first was from Marx Toys, proudly made in America. Marx was one of the largest toy companies in the world. They were founded in 1919, and by the 1950s, when Mattel started up, they were selling 1 out of every 5 toys in the country. That's Louis Marx, the founder, and a very, very big toy legend, if you will, in the both the collector and just toy history. Marx toys have gone on to become some of the most collectible in the entire industry, with conventions set up just to sell, look at, and appreciate all of the product that came out of Marx for pretty much the first half of the 19th century. And much like other toy companies, they were making toys that, well, almost every other toy company made. Things like, your standard giant robots. In fact, one of their more famous ones was the original Rock'em Sock'em robots. Mattel now owns this one and still makes commemorative versions. But they also made tin toys, and they made dolls, they made action figure-esque items, and they did a lot of soldiers, toy soldiers, the non-articulated ones. They were one of the biggest companies making this during the 40s and 50s, even doing Invasion Day play sets where you could recreate things that happened in real life in World War II. They got into sort of the action figure category in the late 1950s, early 60s, starting with kind of public domain things like cowboys, firemen, other aspirational characters. But their first major licensed action figure was the Batman himself, Bruce Wayne. And here it is by Marx Toys, complete with fire extinguisher action feature or action accessory. The cloak was removed. The cape was removable, but once you put it on, you got a very kind of slightly off model looking Bruce Wayne. Well, for the time, it was pretty revolutionary. And even though the bat signal wasn't the greatest, it was the first Batman toy. Marx would follow up with actually quite a lot of Batman toys in different categories, from the, well, Batman doesn't carry guns, but there were all sorts of different form factors that Marx was able to put Batman into. All right, flipping over to the other side of the comic book industry, Marvel, one of their more toyetic characters, the Wolverine. Well, Logan, over the years, has had a lot of toys, but would you believe his very first action figure was actually part of the Secret Wars toy line? For those of you not in the know, Secret Wars was a Marvel crossover event, and it was done in conjunction with Mattel. Both Mattel and Marvel teamed up to make this line together. In fact, the reason it was called Secret Wars is because they tested out a whole bunch of words with kids, and they found that the coolest words kids picked out together was secret and war. So they put them together, and that's why it became Secret Wars. Secret Wars introduced some new looks for characters like Doctor Doom, but for the most part it was the traditional Marvel Universe facing off on the Beyonders planet. I won't get into a whole thing about the storyline, but it was basically an alien takes a bunch of Marvel villains and a bunch of Marvel heroes and throws them together into combat to see what happens, because that's funsies. And this line gave us our very first Wolverine action figure. He's gone on to become one of the most dominant and best-selling characters as far as the action figure form factor, but Secret Wars was where he made his premiere. In fact, he wasn't the only character to get his very first toy in the Secret Wars line. One of the main secondary villains, Doctor Doom, of the series, in his new sort of bionic look, also got his very first action figure in Secret Wars. And if you're going to dig deeper, Iron Man also, well, you might say, oh, no, there was a Mego figure. Well, yes, there was a Mego Iron Man, but that was Tony Stark. This was Rhodey. And Rhodey wore the traditional armor for quite a while, and according to the bio on the back of the figure, it's Rhodey inside the armor. We've never had that since. Also, Secret Wars brought us our very first black suit Spider-Man since the symbiote suit was introduced in Secret Wars. So, back to Wolverine, getting his first figure. He had an interesting feature where his claws actually clipped onto his wrists, as opposed to later figures where the claws were either sculpted or had an action feature where they would come in and out using a lever, like in the Toy Biz line from the 90s before Marvel Legends. Of course, he came with the shield and the swappable images that could be put on it, because that's what heroes do. They show pictures of themselves on their shields. Why Captain America's shield didn't come with an actual image of his shield, who knows? But hey, it was toys in the 80s at its best. Now, of course, the Marvel license is over with Hasbro, so getting more Marvel Secret Wars figures from Mattel, even commemorative, is not really in the cards. Hasbro makes all sorts of stuff, from high-end prop replicas to Marvel Legends being accurate to the movies, including Gut Thor. Mattel does make Marvel toys, just not action figures. They have a robust Barbie line with quite a few characters, from Black Widow to Jean Grey, and they do character cars for the Avengers as well as other Marvel properties. And of course, Uno is pretty easy to market into any category, so Marvel Uno. All right, so wrapping things up, I'm doing a second Marvel character. Let's talk about an obscure Spider-Man villain, the Spot, and when and where did he get his first action figure? Well, for those of you who aren't familiar with Spot, he's a character that entered the dimension that Cloak from Cloak and Dagger, and he was introduced in Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man 98. He then goes on to both harass and be laughed at by Spider-Man for his name and his odd superpowers, but Spider-Man pretty quickly learns that Spot is a character to contend with, because his ability to pop out of any portal that he can just pull off of his body, hey, it's made him pretty cool, and he's even appeared in some of the animated series. So, Spot's very first and shockingly only action figure was in the Marvel Universe large size line that Toy Biz put out towards the end of its run before putting out Marvel Legends. This line included mostly A-listers, or at least A and B-listers, from the early 90s. Bishop was pretty big back then, and, the Human Torch is always on fire. Ooh, no pun intended. Spider-Man obviously got his figure, and, well, this line introduced us to our only Spot figure ever. Now, disappointingly, the figure was a repaint of Spider-Man. You can tell from looking at his hand, which is in permanent web shooting pose. But hey, at least the Spot got a figure. Clearly, fan demand out there creating customs like this Lego figure or a lot of custom Marvel Legends figures shows that we want our Spot figure, right? Everyone's been demanding this. It's the top of every list ever since Firestar got her figure. Okay, well, maybe it's just me. But hey, if I had a wish, I would make a Marvel Legends Spot figure, but alas, my ability to control that is limited. I hope you enjoyed this video. Would you like to see more firsts from other characters and how they got their first figure? Which characters would you like to see? Love to do a follow-up video. Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you there. Thanks so much for watching. Share, like, follow, and it all helps the algorithm. We like sharing toy knowledge. Thanks for watching.